Shame you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's glad that we could all make it this far, and thank you for all being here. It's been a great term. So we have an interesting case for you today, which is one of Stepfel's favorite cases ever, actually, so hopefully we'll all like it. The basic construct is that, so currently in the United States, there is an executive order against assassinating leaders of other countries, against political assassinations. We're going to say repealed. So, any points of question? I think it's pretty simple. You guys are okay? Awesome. All right. So we have three main points that we want to talk about. The first one is sort of adopt a comparative analysis of comparing this with other alternate ways of dealing with sort of rogue nations, rogue leaders of other countries. Secondly, we want to compare and explain why it sort of is an alternative that doesn't overstretch the bounds of our political and military authority. And lastly, we're going to talk about deterrence and why this in fact deters a lot of really bad action, and so it gets a lot of benefits. So the first thing, I think that, obviously, like, assassinating people in general is something we prefer not to do. So you should look to the alternatives. What other mechanisms do we have of dealing with, rogue leaders who are doing things that are really bad to their own people or really bad to us? And I think that there are sort of three main areas. I mean, first, there are military interventions. Secondly, there are sanctions. And thirdly, there are like more diplomatic efforts. So like on the military side, you see there are a lot of potentially really bad harms to military intervention. Like, sure, it works sometimes, but it's really, really expensive. It harms American lives. It potentially kills innocent people. In fact, it usually does. And it destroys the economies. Like, Iraq is a perfect example where military intervention didn't really work very well. In the end, Iraq's starting to be resolved. But hell, it's taken us 8 years or something, right? I don't even know when we invaded Iraq. It's so long ago. Clearly there are some really big problems with this alternative. I can't remember when we invaded Iraq, right? So that's the set of problems with military intervention. But secondly, on the sanctions side, sanctions also rarely achieve their goal. Why? Because most of the time we're applying them to dictators who don't really care about their people, don't really care about their economies that much. And so as a result of that, the weight of the sanctions tend to fall in the lowest classes of society, the people who are already marginalized anyway. We don't think it achieves any sort of change in the actual government. And lastly, if you look to diplomacy, again, who are we applying these, who are we, targeting? We're targeting people like Kim Jong-il, don't give a fuck about diplomacy. They're going against all diplomatic efforts whatsoever, and they're basically just gaming the system. So why does political assassination fix all these goals? Well, first of all, it's really cheap, it's really easy, and we can do it essentially really quickly. It takes virtually no money, and also, it can be done to essentially any leader whatsoever, whereas a lot of these alternatives, we can't apply to everyone. And so we think that it always should be allowed as sort of this option for our use, a tool in the toolbox, because we think that it has these sort of benefits. And obviously, we're not going to apply it in every single case. We're going to choose the right option for the particular case. But we think there are lots of cases where, in fact, this is the best option. I think a good example of that is North Korea, where you have these countries that do exist, where the entire regime is based around this sort of cult of personality. We think that taking out the head of that cult of personality really essentially changes the entire dynamic of the country, changes the government very quickly, and ultimately resolves the whole problem. But you disagree.
What does having the executive order on the books have anything to do with using it as a tool in the toolbox?
Okay, so we think that when there is this executive order in place, there's actually a codified rule against it. We think that presidents are not going to want to violate executive orders. In general, when there's some sort of codified law against them, codified regulation against them, you're not going to want to use it. And furthermore, we think that it also looks really bad. It makes executive orders pointless. If we have executive orders and then go around them, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's sort of, if that's the case, why would we ever have an executive order? So let's talk about overstretching our bounds, because this is something that's really important too when you consider these other alternatives. That using all these alternatives requires a lot of forces and a lot of military and economic force, and it's very hard to rally international approval around it and domestic approval. And with assassinations, you have none of these problems. So let's look at international approval. So to make military intervention, sanctions, or diplomacy work, you essentially need a very large part of the population of the world, a very large number of the countries in the world, to agree and go along with you and work with you. And we think that oftentimes this isn't the case because you have countries like China and Russia that have veto power on the Security Council that can sort of undermine a lot of these efforts. You see this with Sudan, China and Russia are not willing to have the UN take really, really significant steps in Sudan because China has these connections with the Sudanese government, etc. And so we think that it's very, very difficult to sort of rally the entire world in lots of cases to have any sort of significant and meaningful action. Whereas with political assassinations, you don't have this problem because you can do it very quickly, discreetly, and unilaterally if necessary. But also, and perhaps more importantly, on the domestic level, in order to do any of these other alternatives, you need significant domestic support for these issues. And it's very, very hard to do that because they impose a huge cost on the American people. Americans are never going to want to spare American lives in third world countries, to stop genocide. And that's the cost right there. That's the problem, is that when the United States isn't willing to intervene in these cases in countries like Africa, you have genocide, you have hundreds of thousands of people potentially dying. And I think that's where we see the real benefit, is the cases where this really can be applied most are those cases where hundreds of thousands of people are dying and we currently can't do a damn thing about it because Americans simply aren't willing to do it. And I think that this alternative allows us to do something about these incredibly important issues where there are massive human right issues going on. But finally, let's talk about deterrence, because we think that this is a particularly interesting case where we don't actually have to ever use this policy in order to actually deter dictators. Merely taking away the executive order against it and the threat of using it can in fact create deterrence. Because right now, look, that if you're some crazy dictator or whatever in some African country or Kim Jong-il or something like, and you sort of catch the ire of the United States, you realize that there's always ways you can sort of game the international system to get around the United States. But with this in place, there's this immediate threat that you could in fact lose your life. And we think that the mere threat of this happening will force you to sort of try and placate your people. It will prevent you from engaging in these sort of genocidal actions in the long run. And we think that we can essentially do nothing and still have this threat of force be an effective deterrent. And even if we use it once, if we show that we're willing to use it once, that in fact increases the sort of legitimacy of this threat as well. So we think that this has a huge disincentive to committing human rights violations, since we merely need to turn the attention to these countries to have ourselves be taken seriously. And it's a way more credible threat than military intervention, sanctions, diplomacy, all these other things that can basically be tossed aside. And also, since we're getting all these benefits, rallying, since we don't need to rally international approval around political abuse of political assassinations, and because this is way better than all these alternatives in a lot of these specific cases, and we couldn't do anything about these specific cases otherwise, we are very, very proud to propose this case. That was 650.
I thank the Prime Minister and call upon the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Alex Taubes, to deliver the second constructive speech around, not to exceed 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, members of this most august panel, most august House for being here. Side note for proposing a really interesting case. Ryan, you're a really awesome partner. I'm really unhappy that I only had a couple chances to debate with you, but this has been an awesome time. So my basic overview is this. So they talk about a lot of the harms of other methods, and I could talk a lot about the harms of assassinations. I think that what we're going to tell you is, on balance, assassinations are a bad tool. So the only time you should ever use them is when they're absolutely necessary. But we say that you can only, we say that it's better to use them only when they're absolutely necessary, through, not by revoking an executive order and telling everyone we're going to do assassinations, but by outsourcing it to other countries so that no one knows you're doing it, so you capture none of the harms of assassinations, so that you can't be blamed, but you can get all the benefits that they talk about. So, the first thing that I want to talk about is soft power. Because recognize that revoking this executive order, while it might change the American law, it won't change the international law, which is steadfastly against the use of political assassinations as an illegitimate tool of war. So at that point, I don't know the name of the convention, right, but there are plenty of conventions out there that are against political assassinations. At that point, what you're going to do is you're going to show that the United States has an unwillingness to participate in international organizations. This is a couple of harms. First of all, there's the soft power harms that I'll talk about in a little bit. But the second harm is that it delegitimizes international institutions when we're constantly trying to get other countries to get involved in them. We think that it contradicts our diplomacy and harms us abroad if we're trying to get countries to sign up to the new Kyoto protocols, if we're trying to get countries to sign up to conventions on torture, which has been a new goal of the Obama administration. At the same time, we're backtracking on the previous commitments we've made to international organizations. We think that's particularly harmful. But now I want to talk about soft power, because there was this decade called the 80s. Or called the 60s and 70s, right? There was this time called the Cold War, right? And during this time called the Cold War, there were all these countries in South America. And what tended to happen in these countries is that they tended to elect Marxist leaders. And so what did we do during this decade? We started assassinating them. We started assassinating them with pretty much regularity. Look to Guatemala, look to Chile, all these sorts of examples. What happened? These countries knew that America was assassinating because the CIA was quite open about the fact that they were sending political advisors there. They were, good buddies with the next government, things like that. What happened when these countries figured this out, later deposed the people who came to power? I'll talk about power records in a little bit. They refused to even talk to us because of our use of political assassinations. They saw us as an illegitimate actor in the international sphere. So when Gerald Ford tried to start the Organization of American States, countries in Latin America refused to join, refused to economically cooperate with us because we had previously assassinated their dictators and didn't disavow it as a policy. That's why he enacted the executive order saying we will not use political assassinations against people and against leaders of countries. Because it denies countries their sovereignty, and because countries see it as illegitimate, they refuse to cooperate with us and causes a lot of soft power harms. Now, you might be able to force a country with hard power to do a lot of things, but you can't force a country to do things like cooperate with you economically, cooperate with you on drug trafficking, cooperate with you on border control efforts, do things like information gathering when you're trying to capture terrorists. These are the kinds of things where you need to have them politically on your side. But these countries won't even talk to us if we look like we're going back to the bad old days, where if we didn't like the results of their election, we'd assassinate their leaders. They might say they'd only use it for purposes. Other countries won't believe us with our past track history. That's the reason why we shouldn't repeal the executive order. So the second independent point I want to talk about are the negative effects of assassinations. Now note that I don't mean to say that we should never assassinate anyone, right? It's impossible to say that something should never be in our toolbox, because if we don't do it the dumb way and only do it when it's absolutely necessary, of course there might be a possibility where it might be beneficial. But what we're saying is there are lots of negative effects of assassinations, we're about to talk to them, and that these negative effects mean that there should be an extremely high access bar before we ever use this kind of practice. What are the negative effects of political assassinations? The first thing is, it doesn't, as they say, break the cult of personality. What it does is it takes out a figurehead, usually, or maybe someone who's charismatic. What does this create? Since these states either are not very much controlled by the leader, making it ineffective, or extremely controlled by the leader, well, if the latter is true, it creates a power vacuum, where no one is in power, and anarchy gets created in these countries. What's the result of this? Well, first of all, there's usually civil war, which leads to a lot of innocent deaths. And if we care about human rights and all these sorts of things, and lots of people die, we don't want civil war. Now imagine the genocide in Sudan. Imagine if it was a full-blown civil war, it would be a lot worse. We think that that's really important. But recognize that what's the result of this civil war? The result of this anarchy is that the strongest, most authoritarian groups in the country that has the strongest power of arms, is able to take over. Unlike, say, a military intervention, where we can set up legitimate means for people who are oppressed to take power. So what does this mean? It means that the country is usually worse off than it was before. But what's the second thing that's the problem with this? The people who take over aren't necessarily friends of ours. And what's the best way to unify a country when you've just taken over after a civil war? Blame an outsider. And when we have a public policy of assassinating dictators, what can they do? They can use nationalistic backlash against the United States to unite the country. This is bad for two reasons. First of all, because it solidifies the power of authoritarian dictators and makes it very profitable to launch a successful civil war. The second problem with it is that it means that this country now is refusing to cooperate with us, which is really important when you want to do things like, I don't know, bring justice to the perpetrators of a genocide, or bring order so these things don't spill over in other countries, or deal with refugee problems, or deal with the victims of these sorts of things. At that point, we think this is an extremely bad policy. But let's imagine we live in a country called assassination land. And like, if we got rid of this one guy, everything would be better. It's like the hypothetical world, right? Toolbox. If this such a country exists, this leads me to my third independent point, which is called outsourcing. Because if there's one good thing that America can do, it's outsourcing. Because what we say that we do on our side of the house is, if there's a country that the problems would be solved by outsourcing, we say, go to Israel, say you guys have a really good secret service, it's called Mossad, and you go do it for us. And what's going to happen is, if there is some country where a perfect solution would be assassination, they're not going to be able to give it to us, because I can give you a million reasons why it would be a bad idea in any situation. But if there was such, we say, don't get blamed for it because of the nationalistic backlash things that I just talked about. So we get all the soft power benefits of abiding by international law. No one can trace these sorts of things because it's just something that we talk about on the negotiating table. And we actually get it done more effectively because, as we all know, foreign workers are far more efficient than American workers, and we tend to blunder when we go abroad and all these sorts of things. Israel has a really great track record of assassination. Mohammed Yassin and things like that.
So you think that the Arab world is going to love us 10 times more when it turns out it's the Mossad that's killing Ahmadinejad and not us?
Like, listen, this is why I say you probably shouldn't kill Ahmadinejad. We're really against assassinations, right? I say don't assassinate Ahmadinejad. I'm saying if there were a situation where assassinating someone would be good, it's a lot better that they don't think we did it than if they think Israel did it. Why? Because you know what? They're probably going to hate Israel anyways, as you hinted at by the fact that they don't like Israel, they'd be mad if Israel did it. But if Israel does it and we don't, we can be like, listen, we didn't agree with what Israel did. We're against it. In fact, look, we're going to make Israel sign a ceasefire right now. But talk to us so that we can actually come to the table and get something for you. Whereas on your side of the house, they don't even want to talk to you because, like, you guys are cool with assassinating people. We don't want to even have a leader in the same room with you guys. At that point, we don't think that's something that they're actually going to get a comparative benefit. But they have to show us first that assassinations are good before that's even actually an argument. So first, and I'm going to go case side. The first thing they talk about is how, like, in general, rogue leaders should be dealt with in this sort of way. And they talk about how all of these other sorts of options are bad. Recognize that I can give you a lot of reasons why these sorts of options are actually better, right? They talk about military interventions and how they tend to cause a lot of bloodshed and things like that. What we would say is that there are plenty of military interventions that, while they have caused bloodshed, have not actually led to a massive amount of loss of casualties. See the intervention in Kosovo with NATO and things like that. We think there have been plenty of examples of successful multilateral interventions which have actually done a lot of good. We don't think that assassinating Slobodan Milosevic would have actually brought anything, made anything better in Yugoslavia. First of all, because you create a power vacuum, as I talked about before. Second of all, because you probably make a worse civil war and infighting within the Yugoslavian power structures. Third of all, because you never bring Slobodan Milosevic to justice at the International Court in The Hague. And fourth of all, because countries would see that we were violating international law to bring him down, instead of cooperating with international law to bring him down, by cooperating with NATO and actually bringing him down in a way that was lawful. At that point, we say military intervention should be preferenced over assassinations. Then they say diplomacy doesn't work because these people often don't care. Like, we have also seen plenty of examples where it has worked. See Libya, where we're able, through soft power diplomacy, able to get him to stop his nuclear program. They say sanctions harmless evil, but sanctions are also really effective at getting countries to stop their nuclear programs. See South Africa. But finally, they say that multilateral organizations are inefficient because you have to get all these sorts of people to agree. Like, it is difficult, and that's why sometimes you have to do something like a fake multilateral intervention, like what NATO really is. And sometimes you can't actually get a real consensus. We think it's a hell of a lot comparatively better than acting on your own to assassinate someone, which has a negative effect publicly when you first lift the executive order, and then a negative effect when everyone really knows that the assassination was done by America, because we don't even have a rule against it. Now, I was on a POI and asked about this, and they said it's really bad to have an executive order while you violate it. Like, that undermines the idea of laws. Like, I guess that's sort of true, but it's not against the law to have another country do it. The law just says we're not allowed to do it. So I don't really think this is a problem for us. But the next thing they say is, like, deterrence. And I think that this argument is important, because this is the comparative benefit they have. Because they're openly saying that they're going to assassinate people who we're not. What we say on our side of the house is, like, generally, like, this deterrence is not really that big on their side of the house either. Recognize that it's very difficult to assassinate leaders, that they're not going to be assassinating everyone for the reasons that I talked about. So at the end of the day, they're not getting a huge deterrence effect. But we think that we can still get some of that deterrence effect if we ever, assassinate someone using these secret services, right? Like, leaders will know that, like, the accidental bridge collapse, like, there will be rumors about it. Someone might know that, maybe we shouldn't have been that bad. But furthermore, we think that these leaders who are talking about deterrence generally aren't that deterred by, like, threats of these sorts of things, right? Slobodan Milosevic was captured, he was brought to justice, but we still see Omar al-Bashir. These people are megalomaniacs, they're irrational. They're not usually deterred by, like, rational policy instruments. We don't think that we should be creating our policy in this sort of way. For all these reasons, we're very proud to be close. 9 minutes and 55 seconds.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his remarks and calls upon the Member of Government to deliver the third constructive speech of the round, not to exceed somewhere around 9 minutes.
So thank you, Madam Speaker, for calling me up here today. Also, thank you for giving us this great shortening of our name to Sheik Robinson. We enjoyed it. Thank you to the opposition for a spirited opposition. And I hope you all will give me the same leeway that you gave the Leader of the Opposition, because I think there is a lot of stuff to be doing. There's a lot of things. So before I get into the specifics of the case, I think there's sort of two, we'll start with just one sort of overlying thing with the opposition. They say, well, we can sort of get around this and do this anyway, even without the executive, even with the executive order. Well, there's some major problems that we're getting into that. First of all, I think it's a bad policy to have a law on the books that you never intend to follow. I think it makes all executive orders seem a lot less reasonable and a lot less likely to be followed in other places if you have laws on the books and you pretty much acknowledge that you're not going to follow. And second of all, we think that essentially you lose the entire deterrent effect because we want a consistent policy of if you're a crazy dictator in Africa who's like slaughtering your people, then you have a serious chance of being killed. If instead you have to weigh it against, well, is the White House counsel's office going to be against it in this one particular instance, and maybe they'll go to Israel, maybe Israel will be willing to, maybe they won't. It's like, I mean, with all these things, you completely destroy the deterrent effect. So we think that essentially having this law off the books is really, really important. With that said, let's go into some of the specifics of it. So I'll deal with, they start with outsourcing, but it's also their third point, so I'll save it for later. So the first thing that they say is that, if the U.S. bucks international law, it's going to make us look absolutely terrible. So first of all, I'd like to point out that, like, we buck international law all the time. Like, the whole point of, having international law, I think, is that it's sort of made by superpowers, but thank you, to sort of be followed as superpowers. So for instance, we love the United Nations, but when it gets in our way, we invade countries nonetheless. We love the United Nations, but no thank you. When Russia prevents us from intervening in a mass genocide in Kosovo, we use NATO instead. Like, the fact of the matter is that we're weighing potentially millions of human lives against the letter of the law. And we think essentially our main allies in the West, the people we actually care about, are perfectly okay, no thank you, with us following this kind of standard. We think as long as we're using this legitimately, then we're not going to see any loss in American standings on anyway. But the second thing to keep in mind is that these international laws are largely outdated. We think that they're largely a product of a time when we believe that, a nation state and a political leader sort of represented this nation state idea. We don't think that's necessarily always the case anymore. So for instance, you have a situation, I'll take the end of this point, in say Zimbabwe, where it's unclear where we think that there are actually sort of two political units within the country. There's Zimbabwe's faction, there's Mugabe's faction, and there's Morgan Tsvangirai's faction. We don't think that there's this necessarily united state. It's very hard to tell the distinction between a nation state and the state terrorist apparatus that is largely ZANU-PF right now. We think that essentially, given that states are often very hard to distinguish from sort of, just large paramilitary machines. So for instance, in Eastern Congo, there really is no state out there, they're just forming militias. I think that, essentially to make this law, is often it simply shield people who are really just brutal militia leaders by allowing them to claim their heads of state. Yeah.
You say we should fuck international law. I thought that we shouldn't ever have laws on the books, but not follow them.
Yeah, so I think this domestic law and international law are completely different. Everybody expects people to follow domestic law. International law, everybody agrees with something else. I think that's real. And so I think that, particularly when it comes to conventions like this, that we're not going to see our standing. Particularly since I think this would be in consultation with countries like Britain, at the House making it. Yeah, we make this off Russia, but I also think that's really all that's different on either side of the House. So then I can give this example of assassination in Central America. First of all, I'd just like to point out before it didn't start the OAS, it existed well before. Cuba was thrown out of the OAS in 1962 after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So just a point of historical interest there. But also they talk about assassinations in Central America. So first of all, I think that this they're going to have a contradiction here, because we didn't really assassinate people. We did what option 3, what point 3 was on their list. We got other people to go assassinate. We allied with, say, the Chilean military to topple Salvador Allende and knock off people there. Or we allied with a neighboring country here to invade and try to knock off leaders that way. So I don't think this is necessarily a better thing. But second of all, the Cold War was fundamentally different. We did a lot of bad things in the Cold War because we were fighting the Soviet Union. I think we live in a fundamentally different world now, where I think it's completely ridiculous to assert that because we bring back this potential option, that we're suddenly going to use it in an absolutely horrific way. I think that we saw how bad things were in the Cold War. We now have that as a metric to weigh ourselves against. I don't think that we're going to go around knocking up people in Central America because of this. I think that was simply the facts of the time require sort of pushed America in that direction. We don't have that Soviet threat anymore. There isn't really anybody else pressing us for dominance in the Western Hemisphere, so we're not going to be going around using this wantonly. They say, well, you can't get. They say, well, you may not be able to get info gathering or things like this with assassination. We agree. We're not saying use assassinations all the time, simply when it makes sense. Then they say that there are lots of bad effects of assassinations. So I think the first thing is that we agree. We don't want to use them all the time. We use them in cases where it makes a lot of sense. So for instance, in Zimbabwe, maybe knocking off Robert Mugabe would make a lot of sense. Because there is this guy, Morgan Tsvangirai's, with a substantial political base behind him who could quickly take powers. I'm going to talk about Yugoslavia a little later, but I think that might also be an example that goes to our side. But I think there's also a sort of contradiction here. Because they're willing to assassinate people. They essentially say, well, the law in the books doesn't really mean anything. No, we can always have other people do it. So I think that essentially this soft power claim that they're getting is sort of contradicted because they're acknowledging that everybody believes that we may possibly assassinate people anyway. So we don't think they really get the soft power benefits. Instead, all they're doing is not having the kind of clear, consistent standard of deterrence that we have on ourselves in the House. No thank you. They say that people who take over will simply be worse. So we think that essentially, if that's the case, we won't use the option. Second of all, we think that when it comes down to it, there might not be a huge amount of difference. That we think that we would act when we would actually get the support of whoever succeeded. And then finally, we think that if the successor sees that his predecessor was just assassinated for wiping out an ethnic minority, we think we need seriously to consider continuing that policy, don't we? So we think that we actually would get some serious. They finally say that we ought to just outsource. As I said, this contradicts their Central America argument, what we did with outsourcing. We think it makes more sense for America to step up and take responsibility for the action. We think that will further deter us from using this irresponsibly. That will force us to actually consult with our allies. We think that actually setting this standard will create more deterrence and be more consistent. Then they say just use Israel. As I pointed out, I think that first of all everybody's going to know that we were behind it. And so I think they're just going to be more pissed off at both us and Israel. And then the final thing is, when you have this kind of assassination like this, with a large secret service plot, using the Syrian intelligence service or the Israeli intelligence service or whatever, I think it's going to get out anyway. I think it makes a lot more sense for the reasons of consistency, and also because it forces us to actually reflect on our own policies for the United States to be the actor itself. And also for practical reasons, it will make a lot of sense, which I'll get to in a little bit. So moving back to our side. So I think that they completely missed the main point that Adam made. which is that, like, so military intervention, sanctions, and force. Like, obviously, they said they sometimes work, and they gave a couple examples of they work. But the fact of the matter is, they very, very often do not. And in fact, usually when they're used, they impose far more human costs on civilians than they ever do on the regime. So military intervention, for instance, in Iraq, caused tremendous costs, obviously, there. Sanctions almost never work. So, for instance, Iran is going ahead and going perfectly, gung-ho with its nuclear weapons program. And its people are really suffering. But the regime isn't changing its policy at all. We saw the same thing in Iraq. We're seeing the same thing in virtually every country where you use sanctions, where potentially thousands, maybe millions of people are dying or being impoverished because of these sanctions, and no effect is made. Yes.
Which led to more casualties, the NATO intervention in Kosovo or the death squads in Guatemala and the roads after we assassinated our vets?
So I think that that's just the point. It makes more sense for the United States to be the actor in this case, rather than trying to like supply these militias that we can't control. So I think that that's, and then they give the example of Kosovo. So I think that this is a situation that actually flows to our side. So, for instance, the original war in the Balkans, so the original war with Croatia, probably couldn't have been solved with assassination. By the time we get to Kosovo, we're in a situation where there's substantial political opposition within Serbia to Milosevic. And we think that potentially an assassination could, because right after we essentially did intervene, Milosevic was quickly toppled democratically. If he were simply eliminated, we think that the Democratic movement would have arisen anyway. But instead what we did was bomb the country to smithereens, which killed a lot of people, really hurt the infrastructure, and is now making it difficult to integrate Serbia into like Europe. And also, there's still a lot of wounds there that could potentially recreate themselves and potentially lead to war in the Balkans, which is still an extremely dangerous situation. So I think this is an example where we wouldn't want to be able to consider that possibility. Second, we made the argument that essentially it's not that there's an overstretching problem if we don't adopt the assassinations thing. And I don't think they really had a response. We said, look, it takes huge amounts of resources to actually make sanctions or military intervention work. And they say, well, it's worth trying. The point is, what happens when it won't work? What happens if we know that Russia and China are going to veto us in the Security Council? Then I think we ought to have an assassination of the thing. And then we talked about how you also need domestic support. And here's the really crucial thing. Because maybe in like Europe, where we have strategic interests, or maybe potentially in Northeast Asia and in North Korea, where we have strategic interests, we might be able to convince the American people that it's worth them making sacrifices. But in a situation like Rwanda, or Sudan, or whatever it may be, I don't think that the American president is ever going to be able to convince the American people that it's worth American lives to prevent this genocide. We see that over and over and over again. The only option that we have is to use assassination, which leads to our third point of deterrence. Believe it or not, dictators care about liberty. And we think that if we actually create the option, essentially they know that if they act against America, if they're slaughtering their own people, they will die. I think that it's far more effective deterrent. And I think that it's far more effective than the alternative that they give us. So first of all, we think that these foreign secret services will be less effective than us. They say that, it's really hard to assassinate people in general. So fine, if you're like relying on like the Syrian secret service to go around and assassinate people, then fine, that's probably true. But keep in mind, like if we can just smart bomb the palace in Khartoum, like we think it's really easy to kill the dictator in Sudan. Like by letting the United States be the actor, we make assassinations far more effective, and therefore the deterrent becomes far, far, far greater. We also, as we point out, we create a far more consistent standard. Rather than have to worry about whether or not there will be the political capital in the White House to repeal this executive order, or whether or not the United States can find a paramilitary on the ground to commit the assassination for them. If we have this clear standard, if you're murdering your own people, we will kill you, we think that's the way we can solve things like Rwanda. That's the way we can solve things like the crisis in Western Sudan. We think that this is an absolutely essential tool in our toolbox, and we think that simply having it there is going to serve as a crucial deterrent. We're proud to propose. 10:45.
I leave the member of government for his remarks and call upon the member of opposition to deliver the final constructive speech of the round, not to exceed minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam
Please.
Thank you, everybody. As many of you have guessed, I am an international assassin. So this case affects me personally because what they don't realize is that once you take this to remove the black market, I'm going to be out of a job. I don't think they've correctly grappled with these impacts. And the very fact that Jade is laughing shows that he doesn't believe I'm an international assassin. And that's the beauty of the plan. See, everyone's going to be laughing at the idea. It's like, oh yeah, right, the US is sending assassinations, right? Oh, of course, it's crazy conspiracy theories. And yet we will get every single possible good effect of having an assassination. But whenever someone says, hey, Brian, he's an assassin, right? It's just going to be laughed off. We get none of the bad repercussions, but all of the effects. But before we go to the point which Alex brought up, let's give their general opposition to the points, right? Because he gives 2 points, which give like the 2 giant contradictions in the first case. So first thing he says is like the general bad idea about why we shouldn't do things that are against the law, right? Because it's bad to have a law that we don't follow. And then what's everything they say under international reaction? Oh my god, we break international laws all the time. So clearly they don't actually have any respect for the letter of the law. Let's take another quote that Mr. MG said a few seconds later. We're valuing millions of lives versus the letter of the law. Again, so apparently the law doesn't really matter. The purpose of the law overall is like making things work out, right? So if we're able to work things out internationally by subverting the law, we're fine with that. Now, the second interesting obvious sense is bringing back this whole third point. So the problem with our assassinations, if we never explain that we're going to be killing people, there's never going to be any deterrence. Which really makes me question the whole idea of deterrence. Because how are you going to ever deter people unless they believe you're going to follow through, right? So how is anyone going to believe that we're going to actually assassinate unless we actually go ahead and do it? So we're going to have to do it at least once. So what happens? This is no longer like this distant, crazy tool in our toolbox which we never ever want to use, the absolute last resort, right? It's something which we're going to have to do like as soon as possible, which we're probably going to have to use often, and someone's going to have to know that's coming.
Okay, but given that I point out, it's extraordinarily easy for us to do it. And now that we've got this threat, why do we need to actually do it in order for it to be a feasible threat?
Oh, hold on. Is that it?
So, I like to point out at the end of my speech, it's really easy for us to kill foreign leaders. And if we threaten that we're going to do it, we don't think that we actually need to do it in order for it to be an extremely credible
hold on. It's really easy for us to kill foreign leaders. His response is we will bomb their palace, right? Because palaces don't have anti-aircraft weapons, right? And people aren't able to hide under bunkers below their palaces. No, I think it's kind of tricky to get at an actual leader. You have to hire someone very professional, preferably someone foreign, like you. And unless people know that the US has definitely done it, they'll never believe that we will. So you're going to have to come forward and actually do it. So please give me the exact example of when you want to do it, and then we can explain why perhaps we shouldn't do that particular case. But now let's go again on some of the points we got before already. Like, let's talk about the actual effect this has on general international relations, the way the world looks at us. Well, we look at us pretty well, because even though we managed to solve like maybe one random problem by taking out Zimbabwe or whatever, we still need the rest of the world's support to do things, right? The UN still is going to work some of the time. You guys even say that if this is the last resort, we're still going to be using diplomacy. So what's the point of having the whole world against us? And you guys say that international law doesn't matter because we break international law all the time. So apparently both sides agree that laws aren't sacrosanct. But still, we do believe that international law is kind of important, especially when you realize that when we're taking down a regime to build another, the international law that exists right now, that's the foundation of the laws that will exist in that nation. So we're creating a new arena where like there apparently is no international law. Like, you know how Kant's categorical imperative says you should use those things but you want to be universalized? Well, now we're universalizing an idea where you can ignore national law. These radical countries, we don't want them doing that. We want them obeying international law, even if we don't. So, I'll take it later. Respond to this again. We say, oh, it's very bad. We need soft power. We need people to go on like this. We need their cooperation for all the examples, how it's said. We want them to give us information. We want them to extradite criminals. And they're not going to do any of those things if they suspect us. We come up and say, oh, believe, we're the ones who did it. They're just going to be our enemy. And though we can force them all we like, there's something we can force them to do. We can't force economic treaties on them. We need to get those voluntarily. One other response to give this, they said, oh my god, apparently we tried this before in like the 60s and it didn't work. Listen, if you guys know that the US was actually the ones behind that, then that was the wrong way to do it. This is the correct way to outsource. First of all, you don't write it in a bunch of documents that are kept in the CIA file that's released over 30 years so people can see it. No, you don't write anything down. You don't write anything down that people can simply find using quick information search. We keep it completely secret, so it's never traced to us. And we find an actual follower, an actual person we can say it was this group that did it, so they will always be suspected. So it won't be the same problems that happened to us before. We really are blaming someone else while getting the actual practical effects in those very rare cases when we wouldn't use it. So we also give our second point about the negative effects of assassination, why we want to rarely use this. And I think they kind of agree with this mostly, that they want to rarely use it, which is why it's so surprising that they come out and say that, we want to deter people, which means we've got to at least have that as, in other people's view, the primary kind of directive what we're going to do. But consider especially the kind of little transition effect on people's opinions. As soon as we say we're changing our agenda, we're changing our policy, this is what we're doing now, even if we want this to be a tool in the bottom of our toolbox, people are going to see that this might be the first thing that we're planning on doing. So going back to these things like power vacuums, they say, oh, well, we're only going to do these things when there's a strong opposition. Right. So we're creating a great incentive for evil leaders to destroy any possible opposition. So no one's going to run in and take over. So, and we explained that, they're going to be blaming the outsiders unless you find someone else to belong to, who's not me, and that's what the relation is. So the last thing we talked about was kind of the importance of outsourcing and how it's great, how it saves money, how it's efficient, and how foreign workers are far better than Americans, especially when it comes to and so the kind of response to this is returning again to deterrence. They've got to be deterred if they know that it's us. And again, I don't think this is really about deterrence. You can't deter using assassinations. Assassinations are a method of last resort when nothing else can work. I mean, if you want to deter people, say that we can always, walk in our military, it's going to hurt your nation, we can take you down that way. But people aren't going to be deterred unless you actually use it, so you guys feel deterrence. Now, returning case side. A lot of this manages to fall out when we agree that these are all things we can always use sometimes, but sometimes we should use. But just addressing a couple of points I find interesting. They say we can never ever use military means because it's too expensive. And then they also say that we should use other means in assassination of last resort. Well, you can sometimes use military means, like you gave the example of Kosovo. I mean, Iraq has lasted like 8 years, not because it took us 8 years to get Saddam Hussein out of his palace. That happened in 3 days, right? I mean, if we actually wanted to go into Zimbabwe and take down Mugabe, we could do that very quickly. The fact is, in Iraq, it took many years to build up infrastructure, to build democracy over there. That wouldn't happen in any other nations. And the advantage of having military is that sometimes, maybe sometimes we want to kill leaders, all right? We're willing to say maybe in some crazy thing, right? But a lot of the time, we might want to actually put the leader on trial, actually help them to have them face an international court, which you can't do when you kill them. That's the advantage of having some military. That's something we managed to do with Saddam Hussein. We might want to do that. So sanctions apparently don't always work. Diplomacy don't always work. But they do sometimes work. I mean, these are all tools we want in our toolbox, right? But one thing I want to go into this is when they were giving a few other disadvantages to these things, multilateral things are inefficient, and then they say domestic support. If you want to have a war, you need domestic support. Wow. So what kind of domestic support do you think there's going to have when we tell people, oh, we're signing international agreements? That's why we're keeping it on the down low. We don't want the world laughing at us, as I said, and we don't want the country laughing at us either. Whichever president repeals his executive order is going to face a lot of backlash, so will his party, and no one in the nation is going to stand for this. So the last thing they have is, of course, deterrence. I think I dealt with this pretty well. You can't have deterrence unless you use it. You guys don't even really want to use it. So, in those rare cases when we want to take down a leader, hire me. I've got some good weapons, I've got the experience, but don't let anyone know that it was you who did it. Let the international community go on respect you. Keep some appearance of international law going on so you don't have these power vacuums. So you do have refugees. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose. They join yourselves.
No shame. Thank the member of opposition for his remarks, and we call upon the leader of opposition to begin a rebuttal around speech not to exceed 4.5 minutes. Here.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Members of this most august panel, this most august House, it's been a fantastic round. So I'm going to start with the basic overview. At the end of the day, this is a comparative debate. We all sort of agree that assassination is bad. As Ben goes down the flow of all of the arguments I make about why assassinations aren't effective, and all he says is, well, we only use it in certain cases. So we all agree that assassinations are bad. The comparative debate is the difference between our side and their side is that in tiny few cases in which we would ever use an assassination under either of our philosophies, on their side, everyone knows we did it, and we have to suffer the backlash of repealing the EO. And on our side of the House, there's plausible deniability. And that plausible deniability is really important. So I have 2 questions of crystallization. The first is, why would we want to assassinate leaders in private with plausible deniability? So the first thing that I want to talk about is international law. And I think the most important thing is this idea of cooperation. That if we try to, want to have countries working with us in the economic sphere, working on us against terrorism, all these sorts of things, their leaders need to be able to trust us. And furthermore, their leaders need to have the political support to be allies of America. Even if America, if America is violating international law in a wanton fashion, these political leaders are not going to be able to do that. So we harm our international soft power. But the second thing that we do is we undermine international law in general. I think that Ben shoots himself in the foot when he says we buck international law all the time, but then drops my argument about why we think that international law is extremely important and why President Obama's main objective right now is to get countries to join international organizations. That is a killer drop for them. When that is the philosophy that they propose on their side of the House, they have to buy all of the harms I talked about how we can't contradict our diplomacy and still get countries to join into international legal efforts. Recognize that as America becomes less and less powerful, and as China rises, international organizations will become more and more important for American interests. And if we continue this philosophy that they advocate on their side of the House, they're not going to have an effective foreign policy. So we get better foreign policy on our side of the house. But furthermore, we undermine our ability to rebuild when we undermine international law, which is extremely important in these conflict and crisis situations. Rebuilding the infrastructure, building civil society, and bringing people to justice. All things you can't do if there's not a functioning international system. That's the philosophy that they advocate for on their side of the house. But why is the second reason why we're assassinating private? The second reason is because we want there to be a high access bar to ever using an assassination. Recognize that when there is an assassination, a power vacuum is created. He says we should only use it in circumstances like in Zimbabwe, where there's Morgan Tsvangirai. Yeah, there's Morgan Tsvangirai, and there's the ZANU-PF, which doesn't just consist of Robert Mugabe, it consists of a lot of strongmen, all of whom would love to be in Mugabe's shoes right now. What do you do when you kill Mugabe, but do nothing to help Tsvangirai? Two things. One, Tsvangirai dies. The other, the only way he can take power is if he's the most ruthless, and he's the only person who's not willing to deal with America due to the nationalistic backlash you create through assassinations. We indicted Omar al-Bashir in an international court, and they were burning American flags. What do you think they would do if we assassinated the leader of Sudan? They would never talk to us again. That's why we needed to make this executive order. Not because countries don't say, well, they only did that during the Cold War, now they'll never do it again. They say, as long as America is wantonly violating international law, we will not cooperate with you, we will not do anything for you, we will be your enemy, and you can't solve these sorts of problems when you do it in this sort of way. But furthermore, they make assassinations worse because they increase the nationalistic backlash when there's an enemy to rally around, as opposed to the sort of plausible deniability you create when no one knows why it happens. So I'm going to close on the second question of crystallization. How would this affect deterrence? Because at the end of the day, that's all they have. All they have is that if you do this out in the open, these leaders will be more deterred. I attack this in a number of ways in my embassy that they never responded to. The first thing I said was, you don't need to know who did it to be deterred. You just need to know why it happened to be deterred. Listen, if these leaders keep dying, and there are lots of rumors flying around, the plausible deniability so it can't be pinned on the United States, leaders will be deterred. But listen, you don't have to believe that argument for us to win, because I made a lot of arguments why this shouldn't be the philosophy of our foreign policy. These people are megalomaniacs. These people are not deterred by rational incentives and disincentives. I love the University of Chicago, but the real nationalistic furor on the streets is nothing that Milton Friedman envisioned when he was talking about supply and demand. These sorts of things just don't work that way. These leaders react in irrational ways to these sorts of policies. They're not going to have effective deterrence. So what will we say on our side of the house? The only thing that they have left is this idea of deterrence, but what's the final reason why that seals the nail in their coffin? I don't know what the expression is. The reason why they lose. Because the only way it would be an effective deterrent is if you used it often. And the philosophy we've used and they've never attacked is that you should almost never use this practice. They can't have it both ways. Either it's a tool in your toolbox that you almost never use, and they've never given us a plausible example when you could, or you have to use it all the time and have it be a deterrence. They can't say tool in your toolbox and have deterrence. They've lost on both counts. They've lost this round. We're very proud to propose. 5.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his remarks and recall upon the Honorable Prime Minister to give the final rebuttal speech in the round not to exceed roughly 5 minutes. Here.
Okay. First of all, of course, everyone, thank you for being here. It's been a fantastic round. I'm very excited to give that speech. So the first thing that I want to talk about is I think that both sides sort of agree that there are cases in which assassinating political leaders is okay. But I think the real question is then, what is the way in which we go about doing this? On our side of the house, we essentially repeal this executive order. On their side of the house, they leave the executive order and have this sort of nefarious system where they hire these third-party agents who we don't really know about. And maybe they kill or maybe they just steal our money and run away. So we think that you have to analyze this situation in a comparative sense. I mean, if I were the one in the U.S. government who was ahead of hiring the assassins, I would surely hire you, but sadly I'm not. So anyway, so the first point that I want to talk on is sort of this often notion of contradicting ourselves by saying that on the one hand we shouldn't violate our executive order, we shouldn't violate our domestic law, we're violating international law. And so Ben tells you that in fact international law is very different than domestic law. The reason is because international law only gains consent because countries consent to it, and they think that it's implicit in our case that we're deciding to not consent to this law. Why are we not consenting to it? Because we don't think it's just. Well, they agree that it's not just in some cases. Both sides agree that this is not that having banning assassinations is something sort of in many cases is not just. As a result of that, we're perfectly okay, and it's implicit in our case that we're pulling the disagreements. I don't think this is a contradiction at all. The second point, and this is sort of the crux of the distinction between our two approaches, is this notion that they think outsourcing is better. Okay, first of all, we told you lots of reasons why in fact outsourcing is not better. And there are two in particular. One is the notion that Ben tells you, which is that it's simply less effective for the joke I made earlier. Like, what happens when the assassins like take our money and run away? Okay, maybe so maybe then we only hire like Israel to be our assassins. But, like, that doesn't seem much better. Like, you know, it's always going to be less effective, and there's always more potential for it to get out of control, which is exactly what happened in Latin America when we like hired, you know, the alternative political party to take out the political party we didn't like, and then it was just a huge fiasco. So like, we think that there's this huge potential for things getting really messy. But also, we think that there's this notion of deterrence, which is absolutely critical, and they claim like isn't important. But like, recognize that for the whole thrust of our third point is like, in order for deterrence to work, the people who you're trying to deter need to be able to form the expectation that when they piss you off, you will respond to them. But when you are not the agent who is actually attacking them, who is actually taking them out, they can't actually make that causal link that when they piss you off, you know, they die. Like they just out of the blue suddenly they die, and it's not clear like why that happens. Like the whole point of deterrence, we've said over and over, is you need to be able to form these kinds of expectations. And the outsourcing argument, they don't get any of that. They can't form any expectations among these people who are trying to deter. So like you lose absolutely all deterrence. And you know the logical implication of this is they've got to kill a hell of a lot more people on their side of the house. They're getting more assassinations, and you know they're not getting any deterrence. So the second point that I want to sort of touch on briefly is that this notion that I mentioned earlier, that both sides agree there are sort of like good cases in which we can use this system of assassinations. So like, I think what that means then is both sides agree there are some sort of standards that can exist, and are some sort of standards that can cause us to be used in a way that's not abusive at all. So like, we think that assassinations then, they're essentially granting us these assassinations do good things. And then I want to go back to the comparisons that I made with the alternative measures of dealing with these kinds of rogue states or whatever. So like, they sort of misunderstand the point that Ben says, that, you know, we're saying there are cases where the alternatives are military intervention, sanctions, and diplomacy, for example. Like, we're going to say there are lots of cases in which these maybe are the very best things we can do. But like, but that is not to say that these are always better than assassinations. There are some cases in which assassinations are better, and basically it's told we can do nothing about it otherwise. I think Zimbabwe, again, is a really good example. If you take out the leader, like, the alternative groups can come in and take power. North Korea is another really great example, where you take out Kim Jong-il, and like, the whole root of the problem goes away. So like, we think that there are these cases when, even though military intervention in some cases might be the best thing to do, like, there are cases in which it's totally infeasible, and these are the cases in which hundreds of thousands of people's lives are at stake, and when we can't do anything about it, those people end up dying in horrible genocides, like you see in Africa, over history, time and time again. So we think that is absolutely critical. So the last point that I want to make here is this notion of the overstretch, which really sort of got dropped around, but I think it's absolutely critical. And so the whole point here is that like the United States can't really rally the sort of domestic political support to stop these kinds of issues and to to use military intervention, sanctions, or diplomacy. But you realize what happened after we failed in our attempt military intervention in Somalia, right? No American citizen will basically ever be willing to intervene in any conflict in Africa ever again, right? And there are like thousands of people dying in horrible, horrible conflicts there. And so we think that, you know, to the extent that under the status quo, like, we can't do anything about it, we're getting a much better alternative here. So, like, and we think that, you know, insofar as they can't get the same deterrence, you know, that's a huge problem. And I want to close on this notion of deterrence here, because realize that when they don't get any deterrence, like, they don't actually stop people from doing these horrible things unless they actually carry it, unless they actually kill them. So, like, we think that on our side of the house, we kill a few people, but we stop everyone in the world from doing these things, or we provide some disincentive for doing them. On their side of the house, they stop the people whom they kill, but they don't stop anyone else. So for all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.